I've actually lost a lot of friends trying to talk about what happened on 9/11. A lot of them say that they hate conspiracy theories and they don't want to hear it. And I hear you. I hate conspiracy theories too. And that's really why I made this video, because I feel like the 9/11 official story is the conspiracy theory.
We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Dr. Judy Wood earned a PhD degree from Virginia Tech and is a former professor of mechanical engineering. She has research expertise in experimental stress analysis, structural mechanics, deformation analysis, materials characterization, and materials engineering science. Her research has involved testing materials, including complex material systems in the area of photomechanics, or the use of optical and image analysis methods to determine physical properties of materials and measure how materials respond to forces placed on them. She taught graduate and undergraduate engineering classes and has co-authored over 60 peer-reviewed papers and journal publications in her areas of expertise. Dr. Wood has conducted a comprehensive forensic investigation of what physically happened to the World Trade Center site on 9/11. And based on her analysis of the evidence she gathered in 2007, she filed a federal qui tam case for science fraud against the contractors who contributed to the official National Institute of Standards and Technology report.
The moment I decided to do that, I sort of said something to my students. I said, if you knew the world was going to end in a week, and there was very little chance you could save it, would you try?
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
One of the main things that can be observed if you study the videos from the day is what Dr. Judy Wood has called dustification. And this is where you can actually see a significant proportion of the material of which the buildings were made up turning to dust.
So what we're going to learn is that the towers didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair. That's not a collapse, that's dust squirting up. Look at these beams falling with dust trailing behind them, opaque dust. It initially blocked out all of the sunlight, 100% of the sunlight, so it was pitch black. It's very dense dust. And you come to the realization that these pieces of material are becoming dust. They're frothing up into dust as they fall. And they didn't hit the ground. If they had slammed to the ground, there would be over 1 million tons of debris left stacked up in the ground. That didn't happen. Manhattan would have been flooded. Well, as we'll see, the towers were built in the Hudson River with a dike around them. If you slam 1 million tons of debris down onto the dike, you're going to break it. Didn't happen. And if you slammed 1 million tons of debris to the ground, it's going to make a thud. The seismic signals did not reflect that. Michael Ober said, I don't remember the sound of the building hitting the ground. Somebody told me it was measured on the Richter scale. I don't know how true that is. If the building's hitting the ground that hard, why do I not remember the sound of it?
If every floor were to pancake in line with the official model of the collapse, then the time required would be approximately 100 seconds, not the almost free-fall collapse rate of around 10 seconds that we all saw with our own eyes. Surprisingly, there was little collateral damage to nearby buildings that were not targeted. Although every building with a WTC prefix had to be torn down because they were damaged beyond repair.
You realize those dust particles were smaller than anything that's been seen with like fires or with pulverization.
I've got a shortened version of my talk, why the NIST World Trade Center reports are false. Basically, it's about why they're false and unscientific. So today I will discuss evidence related to the official investigations conducted by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, whose reports comprise the final official explanation for what happened at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Before we get to the reports, however, Let me mention that the first pertinent point to consider is the low probability that the only 3 instances of a skyscraper suffering global collapse due to fire occurred all on the same day in the same place. There have been many raging building fires, much worse than existed in any of the World Trade Center buildings, but no global collapse has ever resulted from those fires. We can see from these photos that the towers appeared to have exploded, starting at the top and then going all the way down. At the top of each tower, the debris appeared to shoot upward and outward, as much of the solid structure turned to dust. This is counterintuitive to the idea that the building was being crushed downward. Many of us have asked ourselves, is this what it looks like when a building is softened or weakened from fire?
At the beginning of its final destruction, World Trade Center 2 tips or twists to the east, but turns to dust before hitting the ground. The tipping top falsifies the claims by NIST that it was an inevitable collapse. If the leaning top had fallen as a rigid block, it would have landed on World Trade Center 4. When we look, it is not there. Not only is it not there, but neither is the main body of World Trade Center 4 itself.
That was a big aha moment for me about the tipping top. It looks like it stops tipping, and it looks like it goes straight down. Well, if you look at angular momentum, and you're going to obey the laws of physics, it does. But what it does is prove that the building is no longer a rigid body. You know, the whole thing, tipping, has angular momentum, but if suddenly all of that top portion turns into little itty-bitty specks of dust, each one can keep rotating. So the whole thing doesn't continue rotating as a rigid body, but each of the little specks rotates. And that way it conserves angular momentum and doesn't violate the laws of physics. So that's a way of proving that the top turned to dust.
In this video, we can see that some of the core columns survive the rest of the building being peeled away from it like a banana, but then these core columns themselves turn to dust before our eyes.
Stephanopoulos is down in Lower Manhattan today. George, I don't know if you heard a little earlier me raise this question, which was actually raised by ABC's Jackie Judd as we look at these areas down below. When you look at where the towers used to stand, there is surprisingly so little rubble. Where did all the rubble go?
It's a very good question, Peter, and I have asked some people who've been doing some of the rescue and recovery work this morning. If you look behind me, you can see the very remains, the skeletal remains of the World Trade Center. And one volunteer, Robert Gerlinski, explained to me the reason there's so little rubble is that all of it simply fell down into the ground and was pulverized, evaporated.
Where did the towers go? That's the title of your book. Where did the towers go?
Actually, it was that conversation between Peter Jennings and George Stephanopoulos that inspired this title. You know, where is all the rubble? Where did it go? Mm-hmm. And I was eager that day, like, you know, yeah, I'm glad somebody's asking that. So we have this image of before and after. The little, you know, yellow box on the bottom mm-hmm. corner is all that's left mm-hmm. of the buildings. We've got to remember what used to be there. Mm-hmm. These huge buildings. And, you know, they're gone. And just this little stub of a part of a building is all that's left.
I love these graphics created by Adam Dwyer because they give you a real sense of how much of the building actually went missing. Here's a shot of World Trade Center 1 rubble, and in the background we can see Building 7 still frothing up into dust. So we know it was before 5:20 p.m. that day. So the story that they shipped all that steel off to China just doesn't make sense. They were doing a bucket brigade for a while there, just moving stuff with buckets because they didn't want to, you know, hurt any of the potential survivors under the rubble. In the book Report from Ground Zero, Assistant Chief Firefighter Harry Myers says, "I never saw a file cabinet, never saw a desk, a chair, never saw a telephone, never saw any type of office furniture. There's no glass, it just disappeared and has become part of this fluffy white or gray dust." They actually only found one filing cabinet, if you can believe that, and it didn't even look like a filing cabinet. It was melted down to about the size of a basketball, but miraculously, it still had unburnt file folders and money inside of it that they were able to return to Ben & Jerry's.
Now, this is a really bizarre artifact. It's a Bible artifact that's in the 9/11 museum. The Pope even came to visit this item. Folks often like to point out that formerly molten metal that was on the page, it wasn't molten because it was hot. The pages would have burned up.
Sure.
It was liquid metal because of another reason. This is the elevation map of what was left. Here's what should have been there before. And right here, people survived that little hump at the bottom of Building 3. The rest of Building 3 was gone.
So 16 people actually survived inside the collapse of the North Tower, and they were in Stairwell B in the center of the building.
I rolled to a corner and basically went into a fetal position and just waited for the end.
My helmet started flying off my head. I had forgotten to snap my helmet. So I grabbed my helmet. I guess instinctually I just pulled myself down into the corner.
The collapse of the North Tower created a massive rush of air.
I was blown down 6 stories down to the first floor, and all I could remember while I was being blown down was, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. There wasn't any time to think about anything.
The 110-story tower disintegrated in just 10 seconds.
It was that fast, yet for me it was kind of slow motion too at the same time. And I remember thinking to myself, I said, oh shit, this is it, we didn't make it.
Okay, 10-4, North Tower, stairwell B is in boy on the 2nd floor.
The location given by Jay Jonas was unbelievable to the firefighters listening. The North Tower no longer existed. They asked for his location again.
He asked me that a couple times, and one time he asked me that. Somebody else got on the radio and said, "Where's the North Tower?"
We saw nothing we could recognize in the fields. We expected to see chairs and file cabinets and what was left of offices. Everything was reduced to the finest state. It basically looked like mountains of dirt.
This dome of this 44-story building was right across the street from Tower 1.
It's not even touched.
Right, it's not clobbered.
There's nothing on it.
Right. Building 7 went away that afternoon, and over by the post office, you can see it didn't even spill completely across the street.
One of the key pieces of evidence which shows that this is what happened, that the buildings did indeed turn to dust before they hit the ground, or mostly to dust, is the seismic evidence.
Up above at the top, there's WTC-1's impact on the ground. And what's below that, that blue data, that was an earthquake that was in Midtown Manhattan that same year. It's approximately the same magnitude. And it was a 2.4 instead of a 2.3. But you notice the signals are very, very different. Notice the high frequency of in the blue signal.
Yes.
But notice that you first get the primary wave arriving, that little, it's kind of like snout leading up to the big wave. And then the secondary wave is that bigger one. But you can't see those same signals from when the towers hit. If the towers are slamming down into the bedrock, they should be ringing like a tuning fork.
Right.
Here's the signal for the Tower 1. It lasted 8 seconds. It takes 9.5 seconds to throw a bowling ball off the roof and have it hit the ground below. The building went away faster than it could have fallen. It didn't hit the ground, didn't slam to the ground. That's why there's no S and P waves. There's only surface waves. And that's what you would get if you lifted the building off the ground. You know, think of 2 people sleeping together in the same bed. One person gets up, the other person, in a conventional mattress, the other person feels the disturbance.
Right.
If you lift a 500,000-ton building off the ground, it's going to cause a surface disturbance.
Right.
That's all that was recorded, not anything going boom on the bedrock. This is the King Dome. So here's a controlled demolition, and it produces a P wave and an S wave.
So if we have Seattle King Dome, we're going to look at things relative to that. That made a 2.3 on the Richter scale when it was blown up by controlled demolition. And we have these two towers. Let's say for Tower 2 was the first to go. So if we turn it to dust, all but the bottom 16 stories, and then drop a 16-story building to the ground, we record approximately the same seismic signal as what was recorded on 9/11. Just pretend this rest doesn't exist. And for Tower 2, if you turn it into dust above the 20th story and just drop a 20-story building to the ground, you get the seismic signal that was recorded. And for Building 7, it's all but the bottom 2.5 stories. Where's the rest of the building?
WTC2 just went away at the top, and then WTC1, and then you have these various quarry blasts all day. And then see down here at the bottom, that was an earthquake in the Fox Islands, which is up part of the Aleutian Islands. But look at the thing just before then. That was Building 7 going away. You can't even see it on the chart. It made a 0.6 equivalency on the Richter scale, which is like a jackhammer. And it was 6 times the mass of the King Dome. No wave traveled through the earth. It was only surface waves. That doesn't happen in building demolitions. You know, you always have an S wave and a P wave with building demolitions.
No tall building had ever collapsed primarily due to fire. But that's exactly what investigators believe happened to the 47-story World Trade Center Building 7 on September 11th.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires. We really have a new kind of progressive collapse that we have discovered here, which is a fire-induced progressive collapse. And in fact, we have shown for the first time that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
The buckled column caused additional collapsed floors and falling debris that removed support from adjacent interior columns. A chain reaction then caused other interior columns to fail in quick succession. The outside shell of the building fell.
And our analysis showed that even the smallest explosive charge that was capable of bringing down the critical column in the building, had it occurred, we would have seen sound levels of 120 to 130 decibels about a half a mile away. That would have been an incredibly loud sound, and that sound was not picked up by any of the videos or witnesses that we have talked to. Having a collapse of this nature is a very rare event.
To reiterate, the official story of the collapse of Building 7 is that a typical office fire caused this 47-story building to fall in a matter of seconds. If we were to accept this NIST World Trade Center Building 7 report, we would have to conclude that no tall buildings are safe from the possibility of total unexpected collapse due to office fires.
So there's this new report that just came out last month in March of 2020 called A Structural Reevaluation of the Collapse of World Trade Center 7. Now, this study was conducted by the University of Alaska Fairbanks, their Institute of Northern Engineering, and was funded by the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 and cost something like $316,000. So you can go and download this 112-page report yourself and see once and for all that the official story given by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, That this building fell primarily due to a few isolated office fires and suffered this global collapse, this perfectly symmetrical free fall collapse due to a few isolated office fires. It's just completely bogus, bunk science. There's no truth to it. So you can know that for yourself now. Download the report, read it. My only criticism is that in these 112 pages, they don't mention the seismic data at all, that this 47-story building only made a 0.6 on the Richter scale, which is pretty much indistinguishable from background noise. I think that's a highly significant piece of evidence to mention. So to leave that out is highly suspicious to me, because architects and engineers also don't talk about the seismic data. And when Richard Gage has been questioned at some of his events, he says, "Oh, I don't know. It's all very confusing. I don't understand it."
When thermite cuts out the steel and you have all this steel falling, it's going to make a big rumble when it hits the ground. So how come the seismographic data that you don't present...
Why would it rumble if it's liquid?
It doesn't melt all the steel. Remember you said you cut it out, cutter charges, right? So as the steel's falling, it hits the ground, it makes a big vibration.
And hit the other buildings on the other side of the street.
This is mainly for you, sir. How come the seismographic data from New York City...
I don't understand the seismographic data. I haven't studied it.
It was turning to dust throughout the day, internally. And you saw an enormous amount of material pouring out of the building, one face and one face only for most of the day. And when it went away, it didn't make a seismic signal that traveled through the earth. It only left a surface wave. It did not slam to the earth. And the surface wave that it left was almost a non-existent event.
When you look at these fires, a lot of smoke, they say where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, that's just because that's all we know. Take things like the microwave. Do we really understand what a microwave does? We just know that it heats our food, but it doesn't heat the paper. Why doesn't it heat the paper? Again, why is there all the paper on the ground?
Neither thermal energy nor kinetic energy can account for the events of 9/11. Only directed energy could leave all the paper and plastic ID cards unscathed while turning steel, concrete, and office furnishings to an ultrafine dust.
The whole theory that the thing pancaked, came down on itself, crushed itself, I don't see any signs of crushing. And when I say that, the wheat checks, and the wheat checks are the pieces, they almost look like a hashtag. Everybody knows what a hashtag looks like, right? They almost look like that, but what they are is they're made out of box steel, so they're hollow. And they're box steel that's welded together to look like that hashtag, and at the ends of them, there's 4 holes in the top, and they bolt to the next one that comes down. So these things are just all bolted together. The thing that really has got my attention when I seen that is that the end of these beams are perfect. The 4 bolts are gone. Now remember, these beams are made out of steel, and the bolts that are holding together are made out of hardened steel. So they're probably 5, maybe 10 times as hard as the steel they're holding together. And normally, that's the last thing to go. So if this building actually did collapse or fall upon itself or something, those wheat checks, those ends would be ripped apart. Those bolts would still be there holding the pieces of the flange together, but what those flanges are welded to should be ripped. I don't see any signs. What I see is perfectly square ends of those wheat checks. Even if they rip the bolts through, those holes would be all elongated, torn, that whole end would be ripped out. It's just perfect holes without these hardened bolts. As a mechanic, I've been, I bolt frames together, you extend chassis, you make sure you use hardened bolts, hardened washers, and when you see things fail, the bolts are still there. They're the last thing to let go because they're hard. They're made to hang on. So there's no signs of pancaking. You look at the pictures, you look at like the cover there, there's a better one over there even on this book. You look at the cascading coming down. That's not pancaking. To me, it's cascading. If everything was supposed to be pancaking, you wouldn't see beautiful, that corner of the outer shell of those wheat checks hanging there with, oh, another piece fell off. How do they fall off? How did that one piece come out of that wheat check with all those hardened bolts on it and not show any signs of stress? There's no signs of stress on most of the metal. You look at those wheat checks, every one of them, whether it's stuck in a building across the road, which some of them did. Like these things travel a distance. And you could see some of them that were falling were turning to dust in midair. People go, well, that's just dust on them. I'm going, well, you'd have to have dust 3 feet thick on each floor to the amount of dust. Not even in the concrete that's in there is going to create that amount of dust. So I'm looking at this picture and I see a lot of stuff in here. Street light with the wires still intact, all the signs on it. You got another street light, it's just a street light with a mile-per-hour sign on it, and you have more of them over here. 210-story buildings just came down, there they are, and that survived somehow. And the ends of these beams, if you look at each wheat check, it's like they come unbolted. You look at them, none of them are half ripped or half torn. They've completely, perfectly come unbolted. You look at the evidence. This is like failure analysis. You look at it and go, okay, what does the evidence say? The evidence is saying that this thing come apart. It didn't get crushed. These aren't crushed. Nothing's crushed here.
It's important to realize that the towers were designed for airliner impacts. John Skilling, the structural engineer in charge, said that in the event of an airliner impact, quote, the building structure would still be there.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
Toasted cars. We got to get to the toasted cars. I say they're toast. They're history. I can't say they're burnt because I don't know that. But they're toast. I just decided to use that word to say something happened, messed them up. You can't fix it. You got to get a new one. But this one is quite interesting in that it has an abrupt, toasted, not toasted. Like it's like it's on the showroom floor. It just had a new wax job back there. What abruptly stops? A real fire, a regular fire, doesn't do that. It would be lapping around the corner. Also, why aren't the lights melted?
I didn't hear of any fireballs rolling down the streets, and cars were going into spontaneous combustion. There was no fireball that hit them. They just simply burst into flames for one reason or another. There was even a car park blocks away that the cars started smoking and catching fire, and no one questioned that.
Various detractors like to say that the cars got towed. I don't know about how some of them were, but I know these were not towed. You can see them before and after. And you can see cars adjacent to each other. One might be okay, and the other one isn't.
The other one's fine.
There are witness accounts of what happened to some of these cars too. For example, Patricia Ondrovich, who was a first responder, she, I think, came out of World Trade Center 7, and the cars were exploding right next to her.
The FDNY vehicles were remarkable. They were enormous ladder trucks, pumpers that looked like they were thrown around the fields like toys, and they reeked of unimaginable loss.
If your hand's on a stove burner, it's red hot stove burner, you don't stop and think about it. That hand's off of there. Mm-hmm. It's reflex.
Right.
So if there's some sort of energy field within the building that's so painful, you just have to get away from it. Then suddenly they're out the window and like, how did I get here?
So NIST counted 104 jumpers from all the video and photo evidence that they looked at, but they also stated that the number must have been much higher because not all of them were captured on camera. And without speculating, you can see that something is causing them to jump out the window. It's not a normal situation.
The witness accounts and some of the evidence seem to show that these people were being irradiated with some kind of energy. And a likely candidate is some form of microwave energy, whereby the flesh in these people was being heated up to such an extent that they were jumping out.
You've heard of active denial system? I'm not saying that's what this is, but just as a parallel. It's a microwave, they put it for crowd control. And it makes you think that you're burning up, so you just have to get out of there. You just leave no matter what. You don't think about it. So maybe some people were jumping from that. I don't know if that's what it was, but it's consistent with something like that going on inside the building, but not outside the building. And we do know the building was turning to dust inside for the hour before its demise.
Now let's just summarize the reason why you state that the towers didn't hit the ground.
Well, they didn't burn up, nor did they slam to the ground, but turned into dust in midair. And we know that because if they slammed to the ground, we'd have a pile of rubble left over. If they slammed to the ground, the seismic signal would have shown that, which it didn't. And if they slammed to the ground, they're actually built in the Hudson River, 70 feet below the water table on bedrock. And so there's this dike around them. You get 2 500,000-ton buildings and another 250,000-ton building, slam it down, you're going to bust the water retaining wall.
It wasn't ruptured. If it ruptured, you would have flooded all of lower Manhattan, and the underground, the subways, and so forth. Actually, when they were cleaning up the remains, there's a little corner of Building 6 that was left in the northwest corner. They didn't want to use explosives to bring that down. They used cables to pull it down, or grapplers holding a cable to the thing and rocking it back and forth and pulling it down.
Wow.
Because they were afraid to use explosives for fear it would damage the bathtub wall. And that's just a 6-story building and a corner of a 6-story building. So you have 2 110-story buildings, each 500,000 tons, and that didn't damage the bathtub was damaged, but not by the building's demise, but by the earth-moving equipment that came in, the next day.
That's right.
And the PATH trains, that's Port Authority Trans-Hudson. It goes under the Hudson River, and it comes up on bedrock underneath the World Trade Center on the bedrock there. And you would think if something mashed down on it, it would damage that tunnel.
Absolutely.
It was built, around 1909, I think, is when it opened, something like that. They must have made stuff better back then.
I am standing inside of PATH Train 745, and I have to say, I just stepped into here a few moments ago, and it is surreal. This train is exactly the same, intact, as it was on the day of the 9/11 attacks. They haven't done a single thing to it. As you can see here, there's even pieces of the train still on board, dust and dirt everywhere. So it really remains as it was that day on September 11, 2001.
If we go down below the ground in that corner, well, here's what it looked like. The building, indeed, the main body went missing, just like it was sliced off there. So the mall is in the first story below ground. And there's some firefighters that were walking along there. We're going to go down 1 story and look at them. Here they are. That's right under that area. It's a little bit punched in down here, but you can read Innovation Luggage, Hallmark cards, so you know right where they are. So now we're going to go a couple of stories below that to the loading docks. And it's painted purple under Building 5, so you know where you are, and then green under Building 4. So it's color-coded so the delivery trucks know where to unload. And we're going to look down that direction. Just after 9/11. Listen to the echo in this audio clip.
Going down to the parking garage. We're in quite deep.
These are the first pictures of search crews underneath the World Trade Center, desperately looking for survivors.
That's not a collapsed parking garage. That's not even a full parking garage. It's an empty parking garage. So I wanted to see how far up the dust went, and then I looked at some weather satellite maps, and I saw this. Hurricane Aaron. It's a Category 3 hurricane that was heading towards New York City for 4 days prior to 9/11. It had been around for a lot longer than that, but it made a beeline to New York City for 4 days straight. What is really weird is that we didn't really hear much about it. How can they be 100% sure when and where that thing's going to turn around? A flight attendant who flew out of Boston that morning contacted me after he saw this on my website and said, "We never were told about that. Flight attendants weren't even told about it." Now, there was a high-pressure system coming in from the west, but on day one, they thought that was going to cause it to turn around from the text messaging from the National Hurricane Center, and it didn't turn around. On day 2, they thought it was going to turn around. It didn't. Day 3, they thought it was going to turn around. It didn't. Day 4, they thought it was going to turn around. Well, it's a good thing it did, because they're out of time, because it was right at the end of Long Island, and it was also raining on Cape Cod from the outer bands of the hurricane. And you can't evacuate however many millions of people live in Manhattan. And it wasn't zero reporting, it was well underreported. And you know that weather stations love to milk him for all they can get. They, dramatize the hurricane's coming, are you ready, are you ready? And everybody gets excited about it. This went without a mention. So that was strange in itself. And then I start wondering, okay, what do hurricanes do? And they produce a static field around them. And people talk about feeling the weather change. People with arthritis often describe feeling the weather coming because they're sensing an electrical kind of atmosphere around the storm system. So, okay, I went and looked at the weather reports for the 3 major airports surrounding Manhattan, LaGuardia, JFK, and Newark airports, and all 3 reported having thunder on 9/11.
Now, the unusual thing is that on the 12th of September, it made a right-hand turn of about 135 degrees and headed off out towards Newfoundland. And during the events of 9/11, between about 8 a.m. in the morning and 5 p.m., it held its position, the atmospheric pressure remained constant, the temperature and wind speed remained almost constant right throughout the events of 9/11. Not only that, readings from magnetometers, which are instruments which measure the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, showed unusual variations in the Earth's magnetic field, again, throughout the events of 9/11.
NASA thermal imaging shows that the fires were out and temperatures were no longer hot by September 23, 2001. What can cause long-term fuming without generating significant heat?
At dead of night on America's Remembrance Day, stilled for the first time since the rescue work began 2 months ago, even now there is a sense of awesome, gruesome power. Only the hoses continue to try to damp the continuous fires beneath. The grappler creeps as deep as it dares and lugs at still steaming steel bramble, lifts it then to higher ground for yet another grappler to bash it into shape, and lift it again into a waiting truck. And in this hour, this is happening in 50 spots across the site.
They identified 4 classes of particles in the World Trade Center air samples that have been named by the EPA as likely to harm human health. They found fine and very fine transition metals, acids, in this case sulfuric acid, very fine undissolvable particles, in this case glass, which traveled through the lungs to the bloodstream and the heart, and high-temperature organic matter, many components of which are known to be carcinogens.
More than 10,000 workers at Ground Zero could receive part of a $657 million settlement after they say they were sickened by dust from the destroyed World Trade Center. Some of the cases included a firefighter who died of throat cancer and another needing a lung transplant.
Let's look at some of the samples that were collected from the WTC. You have a variety of all sorts of strange things in the air. And if you look at the boiling temperatures of these things, there's no rhyme nor reason to the amount of the quantity. It isn't that the things that boil at a lower temperature are more prevalent.
Almost immediately in the days following September 11th, there were these dump trucks that were hauling these loads of fresh dirt in and dumping them on the fuming rubble pile.
Documented in Dr. Judy Wood's book and on the website is the activity of various trucks that were actually bringing in dirt to the site. Repeatedly, this was spread around within the World Trade Center site, moved around with earth-moving machines, and then it was taken out again, as if there was something in the ground that was being soaked up by the dirt and then taken away. So it's like they knew that this energy was, to use the term that we came across in research, in John Hutchison's research, the energy was non-self-quenching. It didn't quench, it kept on going.
Dirt is not used to cover smoke from a fire. Maybe a toxic spill or something like that, but conventional smoke does not continue emerging from saturated dirt for months, so we can say that something is definitely strange here. Why were the remains of this fire truck sprinkled with what looks like moist potting soil? Clearly it didn't suffer from an out-of-control fire in these places. This is a photo from September 13th, and we can see dirt all over the place.
A substance called tritium, which is a form of hydrogen like a gas, was found in water from World Trade Center 6 at 50 times the normal level. Now, this indicates that there was some type of nuclear process or nuclear reaction going on. And this has actually led people like Dmitry Karlazov and Heinz Pomner, Jim Fetzer and others to state that nuclear explosions were used to destroy the World Trade Center, but clearly we can see from the videos that this does not make sense, because there were no bright flashes, there was very little noise, certainly not a level of noise commensurate with the scale of the destruction. These were two of the tallest buildings in the world.
A lot of folks say a nuke was used on 9/11. Well, do you think they could have kept Chernobyl a secret? People all the way around the world measured the fallout from that. If there was some kind of a regular nuke used in Manhattan on 9/11, do you think they could have kept that a secret? But here we don't find any of the ionizing radiation that you get with nuclear reactions.
At Texas A&M, a group led by Professor John Bockrath, who is widely regarded as one of the world's greatest electrochemists, reported finding the hydrogen isotope tritium, a key signature that some unusual nuclear reaction was going on.
The first thing was this thing called tritium, which was a sub-form of hydrogen which should not exist except in extremely tiny quantities. We found that by working these cells of Fleischmann and Pons that contain lithium hydroxide and deuterium oxide, that we could produce this tritium in great abundance, let's say at 10,000 times more than it ought to be there, as it were.
Let's assume you're at a conference, speaking before a crowd of people about this. Where did the towers go? And one person raises his or her hand and says, Dr. Wood, can you tell us exactly what happened? What would your answer be?
Well, I can show that the material came apart. It didn't slam to the ground, didn't burn up, don't have anything hitting something, so you can rule out as the cause, the destructive mechanism, you can rule out kinetic energy and you can rule out thermal energy being the causes. Well, as for any conventional weapon, that eliminates anything.
It was in November 2007 that Dr. Wood and I started to discuss something called the Hutchison effect. Now, the Hutchison effect is quite unfamiliar to many people, but John Hutchison, who created the original effect back in the 1980s, is quite well known, and there are many YouTube videos of him and about him if you want to go and look for those. And he actually collected together ex-military equipment, for example, radar equipment, microwave generators, signal generators, and he also used a radioactive source from time to time. And he was able to, over a period of about 10 years, create some unusual effects, such as the warping of metals. He was able to bend copper and steel bars, and he's got pictures of these. In fact, he's generated over 500 pounds of metal samples. I know somebody who's analysed these samples independently as well. So these effects are real.
This is actually a couple of photos that I took today
looking around this sample called fracture. And like I say, I have some incredible elemental images to share with you. It's just unimaginably beautiful what you're seeing, because you can see the interaction, the sort of quantum coherent interaction.
People from the Pentagon actually employed John for a period of time. Colonel John Alexander, who at the time was working for Los Alamos National Laboratories, went and spent 4 months with John in 1983 to look at the experiments he was doing.
You write in your book Reality Denied about some experiences that were technically considered failures, but that you believe had a lot of merit to them. One of them you refer to known as the Hutchinson effect.
Yep. That was one that is really highly controversial. It began, George Hathaway and another Canadian had shown us a film of some things that looked really, really strange. We had items that were levitating, accelerating, burning. One of the problems was the range of effects.
Yeah.
So in that case, I actually paid them to recreate the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, he had discovered a number of these things kind of spontaneously.
But the U.S. military took an interest.
Well, we did for a while. The problem, frankly, is control.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you cannot control the effects, but they're certainly interesting. For instance, they showed me he had a crankshaft. Remember, he's grabbing crap, literally out of the junkyard.
Yeah.
And had exposed to it. They took it to BC Hydro for testing. And the same piece of metal on one end is case hardened steel, on the other end is, soft as lead.
Uh-huh.
And it just from being exposed to things. We had PVC that literally was pulverized and disappeared. Another one, they took a rat tail file, put it between two wooden boards, put it in there. It lit up just like, remember the old incandescent light bulbs?
Sure.
You have a wire across there, and just like that, it lights up. Got to the point the whole file, which was as big as my finger, just lit up and broke apart.
Split in two.
The interesting piece was, this had been white hot. They reached in and picked it up, and it was cold.
That was pretty risky.
Yes.
It appears that these effects were known to people at Los Alamos as early as 1983. In other words, this strange warping of metal, the levitation effect, which John was creating sporadically. Initially, John was not able to create these effects reliably, but as he worked on this and worked out how to tune his equipment, he was able to create effects very quickly within a few minutes. And we have done several interviews with John where he talks about his work and research. And in 2007, Dr. Judy Wood filed a court case, and John Hutchison submitted an affidavit in Dr. Wood's court case.
Upon examination of the destructive effects done to the World Trade Center on 9/11, as documented by Dr. Judy Wood and as reviewed by me, I can and do assert that the World Trade Center was destroyed by devices that are scaled up, refined, and or weaponized versions of the effects that I have named the Hutchison effect. Levitation of heavy objects, the spontaneous fracturing of metals, changes in the crystalline structure and physical properties of metals, fusion of dissimilar materials such as metal and wood while lacking any displacement, the anomalous heating of metals without burning adjacent material, and the disappearance of metal samples. I have witnessed the tops of steel bars turn to dust and white powders as well as chrome plating being blown off other samples. In the years from and after 1979, many members of the so-called and aptly named military-industrial complex have visited my lab, corresponded with me, and or in a variety of other respects, observed my work and my inventions.
If you have buckling from overload, doesn't it bend over? Doesn't it bend around the horizontal axis? Why is everything straight? If you overload these outer columns, they're going to bend. If you mash something down real hard, it's going to bow out. Yet what we have, instead of having it bend over, is curling around the vertical axis. Here's a cluster of 3 columns. And this lasagna noodle emphasizes the fact that this isn't loading that does this. Something else happened to this. This is straight. It curled around the vertical axis, not the horizontal axis. How do you get something to bend more than 180 degrees and not even crack? It's a smooth bend, and it splits at the seams. These are John Hutchison's samples. It curls up like that, like at room temperature. It wiggles back and forth. Now watch this thing. It's going to come apart in here. Weird things happen. This is a very interesting one. I'd like to have somebody, an engineer who claims that that's normal, draw me a free body diagram and show me the loading to put on that beam to make it do that. It's not like a rubber band that recoils. If it's hot and it's flowing, it doesn't have the strength to recoil. Now that's what buckled beams look like. They don't do that. You see through holes there. It just happened at one place. This was found in Banker's Trust. Banker's Trust was determined to have not had any fires in it. Now, let's consider something else here. John Hutchison's work, he's got water drifting up, levitation of water.
David Hansher, the photographer, one of the photographers for the New York Daily News, he reported being levitated, and he was carried a block.
As I hit the corner of Liberty Street, it was almost being picked up by a tornado, almost being picked up by a wave. It was like being picked up.
With the black cloud.
That black cloud had substance. It was like night, but it had a solid feel to it. It was like gravel, and just picked me up and tossed me about a block. At one second I was running, and the next second I was airborne. And I lost my glasses, I lost my cell phone, I lost my pager, but managed to hold on to both cameras.
But it threw you for a block?
I was back down at Ground Zero last week and walked the area where I have a pretty good recollection of where I was and where I wound up, and it was just under a city block.
We also have cars. Some of them nearby were also inverted, turned upside down. So again, these accounts, these events, and this evidence must be accounted for.
And then the wind, a very, very fierce wind, and my heart started lifting me up off the ground. I wasn't sure what was going on. I thought the building might be coming down, and I figured, okay, this could be it, and I was a little angry. I got, so like, damn it, like, why me? Why, I'm beautiful. I'm going to die in the World Trade Center on a beautiful summer morning. It's like a little denial and disbelief sets in, and so then I started getting hit with stuff. It was just debris was hitting me, and I'm like amazed now. 110-story building above us, and I'm looking up at the sun.
Here's John's boat experiment. Well, what it shows is when he turns off his gizmo, then the boat lights up with weird fires. And the cars lit up right after the tower's demise, not during, right after, as though it was right after something got turned off. Now let's think about hurricanes. What do? Well, Hurricane Andrew drove this 2x4 through a tree, piece of plywood. And with tornadoes, I'm sure you've all heard about straw through trees. It's not because they're flying fast. Something weird is going on. There's John Hutchison's sample with a butter knife in a piece of aluminum. He also has one with wood in the aluminum. If the aluminum's hot enough to melt, the wood would have burned up. And we have these coins from the World Trade Center. People like to say they're melted together. I'll point out that zinc melts before copper does. It also boils before copper melts. So that would likely explode, but it's one of the lowest, zinc is one of the lowest melting point materials. So what gives? Why is this stuff stuck together? Now, when I found these, I wondered, why on earth would the car door be peeling split thickness? It's not a laminated structure. Didn't know what that meant, but it was definitely a category of data, and I put it aside. Later, when I found John Hutchison's work, wow, he can peel open extruded aluminum.
NIST produced 10,000 pages of technical reports about the destruction of the World Trade Center, right? 2 companies that were involved in the production of those reports are Science Applications International Corporation and Applied Research Associates. They do research and development in, guess what, directed energy weapons. Yet they helped write the NIST reports. You can go on, again, research that further. There is some group stopping us from having free energy. We need to be aware of that. I don't know who they are, but this is very important that we're aware of it and we map them out if we want to move this forward. This is something that people don't talk about a lot. And Eisenhower, as I started off the presentation, he knew this. He knew this 50 years ago.
We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
I was the first one who filed a request for correction to NIST. That was my act of whistleblowing, where I noted various errors in their report and suggested that they fix this. They'd surely want to fix it and notify their contractors who helped with this who messed up. And some of the examples are Underwriters Lab, who made 2 half-scale models and 2 full-scale models of entire floor spans. They set them on fire, cooked them for twice as long at twice the temperature, Fahrenheit, and none of them failed to support load. Yet they signed off on a report saying that fire did it. That's fraud. A term that I learned early on that it's sort of my motto, empirical evidence is the truth that theory must mimic, not the other way around. The theory needs to match the truth, needs to match the empirical evidence. That is, the fact. And NIST came up with this model, but it didn't match the facts. So the model's no good.
A question NIST tried to answer was, how could the World Trade Center towers collapse in only 11 seconds and 9 seconds, speeds that approximate that of a ball dropped from a similar height in a vacuum? And we independent investigators agree that the buildings came down essentially in free fall, and this is an important starting point. This violates 2 fundamental laws of physics, one being the law of conservation of momentum, and another being the law of conservation of energy. The first law means that hundreds of thousands of tons of material in the cold lower section should have slowed the upper part of the building simply due to the mass of the lower section. The second law requires that deformation of the lower section would consume energy, slowing the fall even more. So there must have been deceleration or slowing. But the upper section, which appeared to be nothing but steel and dust, fell freely in each case. We also agree that the fires in the buildings, whether driven by jet fuel or office furnishings, could not have melted the steel structure. NIST made the point that in no instance did they report that steel in the World Trade Center towers melted due to the fires. The melting point of steel is about 1,500 degrees Celsius. Normal building fires and hydrocarbon fires generate temperatures much lower than that. In other words, diffuse hydrocarbon fires, such as these, cannot produce temperatures high enough to melt steel. Each tower had 236 super-strength steel box columns, making up the perimeter wall, and this was built around a core of 47 massive steel columns. The floor decking ran between in a staggered arrangement. To reduce the effects of fire, all of this steel structure was coated with a spray-applied fireproofing material before the buildings were occupied. And in the aircraft impact zones, this fireproofing was upgraded in just the few years before 9/11. The theory that was claimed to be the most probable root cause for many years, called the pancake theory, in which the floors pancake down upon each other, is no longer supported by NIST. It's really no longer supported by anyone. And since 2004, when my former company did test models of the floor assemblies, the pancake theory has no longer been viable.
One company was used to produce a computer simulation of the plane crash, which is a whole other story. And that company was called Applied Research Associates. And they also do, if you look at their website, research into directed energy weapons systems and components.
They used to have these two photos on their website, and you can still pull them up using Wayback Machine. There's a capture in 2007, and this first one seems to display their capacity to bring about destruction of an urban setting, similar to the World Trade Center complex. The silver building in the background eerily resembles World Trade Center 3, which is the Marriott Hotel. And the beige-colored building to the right looks a lot like Building 7, which was dustifying all day long, but had smoke coming out of the windows on one face of the building only. A strange phenomenon that also seems to be depicted here. Now, in this other photo, we have the Twin Towers and Building 7 and the other World Trade Center buildings that were destroyed. They're glowing kind of orangey red in this photo, as if they're being radiated with some sort of directed energy. So there's a pretty interesting quote on their weapons development, testing, and effects page. ARA also has a current initiative to grow our non-kinetic weapons business area, including directed energy weapons and non-lethal weapons, by leveraging our broad experience base in conventional weapons and senior engineering staff with a long history supporting major government programs.
Another company that was used in the production of the World Trade Center reports was Science Applications International Corporation, SAIC. They were in charge of ground zero security, and this company also, which is a big defense contractor, does research into directed energy weapons systems. So you've got these two companies involved in producing World Trade Center technical reports, and again, what does that tell you? I leave you to draw your own conclusions.
So I'm just going to read to you a bit from Dr. Judy Wood's affidavit in opposition to defendant SAIC. The destructive process clearly seen involves pulverization on a nearly instantaneous basis, not a collapse of steel upon steel. SAIC is complicit with the NIST report in calling this a collapse. This is fraud. They know better. SAIC must be compelled to address the issues, provide documents on, and submit to depositions about the cleanup procedure evident since the beginning. From day one, the cleanup process has been consistent with the cleanup of the use of directed energy weapons. So Boeing was also listed as a cooperating organization on the NIST report, and we know that they were all Boeing planes that day. We also know that Boeing is a big manufacturer and supporter of directed energy weapons. So, yeah. So there's this Canadian scientist named George Hathaway, and he was at John Hutchison's lab a lot throughout the years, documenting his experiments on video camera. He wrote a book about them, and in John's affidavit, he talks about how George told him that him and Alex Sherezky, while they were working at a lab at 13th Street, they disappeared most of the building above them and shocked the insurance company that came by the next day.
Oddly enough, some of these things actually did happen. We had a whole building disappear in 1987 when I was with
What?
I'm not kidding.
A whole building?
I did not see it myself. It was my workers there who worked with Boeing. An insurance agent was to come down to insure the laboratory.
Right.
And basically he came down and found no building, just an empty lot.
Air tanks and water tanks were not located on every floor, but were spaced consistently throughout the height of each tower. During the destruction of the towers, air tanks and water tanks were ruptured, which would send their contents squirting out at speeds relative to the pressures in the tanks.
people often see these squirts ahead of the collapse wave, but what was that? If it's bombs, you'd see a flash and you'd see a whole lot more of them. But if you have the whole building turning to dust as it comes apart, what about the water tanks that are distributed throughout the building? They're going to get weaker and weaker as they're dissolving until they suddenly give way. And I'm tempted to believe that might indeed be what that is. We don't know. But if you got that whole building down on the ground in like 8 seconds, let's say 9.5 seconds, just to give it some extra, it would have to be squirting out here at the base at minimum of Mach 1.5. The air from the middle to get to the outside is like Mach 2.5. For sure, all of the adjacent buildings should look like they were machine gun fired. That's a lot of stuff to squirt out of the way. And that's assuming the building took, 9.5 seconds to come to the ground. Now, people who say, okay, they claim they heard explosions. And so therefore it must be bombs in the building. They're starting with assuming what did it, and then going back to assuming what problem they're solving, instead of determining first what happened. Well, if you recall, blasting zone ahead, turn off cell phones and two-way radios just in case it triggers something. How are you going to get everyone to unknowingly turn off all their cell phones in southern Manhattan for weeks ahead while they prepare the site? But there were sounds of explosions. Bombs go boom, but not everything that goes boom is a bomb. Think of putting an egg in your microwave oven. Turns out there's a lot of folks who talked about these Scott packs exploding at ground level, sitting on the fire trucks.
Firefighter Patrick Sullivan says there was this huge ambulance. It must have had Scott bottles or oxygen bottles on it, and they were going off. You could hear the air go spoom, and they were exploding. So we stretched a line and tried to put that out. Firefighter Todd Heaney says, we were just starting to put out the car fires, and the rigs were going. Ambulances. I mean, there must have been 50 of these things burning heavily. The Scott cylinders and the oxygen cylinders were all letting go. They were all blowing up left and right.
And so we have to ask ourselves, what if these air tanks were being influenced by this energy which was destroying the World Trade Center, and it caused the walls of the air tanks to weaken? We know that the air tanks are pressurized, so what are they going to do? Same goes for any pressurized tanks inside the World Trade Center, such as fire extinguishers, such as some of the components in the pressurized toilet systems in the restrooms and so forth. If there were any pressurized tanks there, or hydraulic tanks that were under pressure, and their walls were weakened in some way, then they would explode. So that might explain some of these explosive sounds in the buildings during the destruction, perhaps.
Has it been tough writing this book? Has your life gotten worse since you wrote this book, or has it gotten better?
Well, it's all relative to your perspective. What I've gotten from this is so much more than I ever thought I would have in learning about life and learning about people, and how much people are easily swayed by emotions and thoughts in groups because they want to go with a group rather than go off and think on their own. And if they're afraid what somebody else will think of them in public, so they have to keep their thoughts to themselves. I mean, all of us have that to some extent. Look at me, right? For the first couple of years, let the grown-ups take care of it. But then I realized somebody needs to take care of it. And other aspects I've learned about is, well, think about this. This is the most unbelievable part of it, or the most shocking part of it, that I believe 9/11 was an attack on human consciousness. My colleagues quit thinking that day. They were told that they saw a collapse. Okay, we saw a collapse. It's not that they're evil, stupid, or anything. It's that something took control of human thinking in a weird way. And if you stop and think more about it, almost the entire planet saw what happened that day right in front of them. And only a few really, truly saw it, what was really happening. That, to me, is a shock. I never would have imagined that.
And that is why this research is so important, that you look at the evidence, you understand it for yourself, you take ownership of it. And you can know this. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's not a theory, it's not a hypothesis. This is something that you can find the evidence for and know for yourselves and free yourself from some of the psychological operations that have been ongoing for nearly 20 years now, and in fact longer with some of the other operations they've pulled. So what we found during the course of this research is that there were various attempts being made to cover it up, and one of these attempts was made by an individual called Richard Gage, who, as few of you may know, headed up this group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now, initially, it seems that he is on the side of finding the truth because he disagrees with the official story of 9/11. So what he was basically doing was what we call a limited hangout, in that he was, as I say, disagreeing with the official story of 9/11, but then putting out a new false story, which essentially was centered around the story put out by Stephen E. Jones, this physicist from Brigham Young University, who we'll discuss more in a few moments. But Richard Gage was involved in setting up this group, and this group was set up, the Architects and Engineers group that is, in approximately April 2007. That's roughly when it started to get going. And this was at exactly the same time that Dr. Judy Wood's court case was kind of going through the system. So we found that coincidence quite interesting. Now, one of the problems with this idea of using thermite to destroy the World Trade Center is that whatever mechanism is used, such as an explosive mechanism or indeed an incendiary mechanism, the building would be cut into chunks, such as if the thermite we'll talk about thermite in a minute, but thermite is this incendiary which burns with a very high temperature and therefore can be seen to actually cut through steel girders, and therefore these steel girders would then, come away from the main structure and the building would fall to the ground. Now, there are two problems with that. One, that we didn't see this hot reaction of thermite throughout the building. We have one or two short pieces of video which seem to show some yellow molten material coming out of one of the corners of the building sometime prior to the destruction. But the thing is, one of the main things that Richard Gage doesn't discuss is what happens when these so-called chunks fall to the ground. Because what would happen is, like you get with a traditional controlled demolition, is that the building would be cut into chunks, those chunks would fall to the ground, and they would create a seismic signature. This seismic signature, which was studied by Dr. Judy Wood in her book Where Did the Towers Go?, and shown on her website round about sort of 2006, I can't remember the exact date when she posted this, but it was a long time ago now. And she showed that the seismic signature was not commensurate with the size of the destruction. In other words, it was, for one of the towers, it was a 2.3 seismic signature, and for the other, it was, I think, a 2.6. So, in other words, the building, if it did come to the ground, didn't make much of a shock at all. And this is no surprise to us because, as we can observe, the buildings turn to dust. So why do they persist with this explanation of thermite? Well, one of the possible reasons is that they want to keep certain evidence hidden, certain ideas in the background, so that people don't think about them. And this is where Stephen E. Jones comes in. He wrote this paper about how the towers were probably destroyed with the help of this substance called thermite, which is aluminium powder and iron oxide mixed together, which you then ignite with a hot fuse. And this, supposedly, according to Stephen E. Jones, melted through enough of the girders to destroy the building. But the problem with this idea, as I've already said, is there were no orange flames, there was no seismic signature, and what actually happened does not match up at all with the use of thermite. So then this explanation morphed, and it said that it was either thermate, which was thermite and sulfur added, and then it became super thermite, then it became nanothermite, and then at one point it became paint-on thermite. So they were very keen to stick to this idea of thermite. And this is probably because they actually knew what to cover up. The thing that they needed to cover up was that what we were seeing was done with some type of energy. It was done essentially with an energy weapon. Now, the history that Stephen E. Jones had was in the 1980s. He was involved in a field of research which became known then because of Stephen E. Jones and his friend, his colleague Paul Palmer, cold fusion. They called this phenomenon cold fusion, which was discovered by Pons and Fleischmann, or rather rediscovered by Pons and Fleischmann actually, in the mid-1980s, and they actually talked about their research publicly in 1989. And the thing why this is important is that they found that under certain conditions, and it wasn't always repeatable, you could do an electrolysis experiment with lithium hydroxide in a beaker, in a small beaker, with a platinum electrode and a cathode, run a current through it, and under certain conditions you could get quite a lot of heat coming out of this, which they couldn't explain. And it was thought to be some type of nuclear effect, more properly called low-energy nuclear reactions. But they decided to call it cold fusion, and that name stuck, and it's still used today. So this is, in the white world at least, is a poorly understood energy phenomenon, which under certain conditions, it appears that if you put, say, 100 watts into your experiment, you might get 200 watts or 300 watts out. And you can read books on this. I'd recommend the book by Dr. Eugene Malev, Fire from Ice, and their videos such as Fire from Water. And Stephen E. Jones was actually involved in essentially a committee which recommended that the research of Pons and Fleischmann not be funded by Congress because it was, not worthy of further discussion, which of course upset Pons and Fleischmann. And Jones headed up this vote to actually kill the research of Pons and Fleischmann, at least kill the funding for it, and it never really went forward. And the whole thing really kind of died out in the mainstream in the early 1990s. I think it lasted a couple of years, and then it was all essentially swept under the carpet and wasn't really spoken of again. It has resurfaced a couple of times in the mainstream in the intervening years, but not by any sort of size that it should, because it is hugely important. So cold fusion is an energy phenomenon and involves the release of anomalous energy. And this should be a clue to what happened to the World Trade Center, because you can see the buildings turn to dust before they hit the ground. So clearly some type of energy change is happening, and initially you might think it was a plane crash, but with some study you can rule out the plane crash explanation. Then you can say, well, it might be bombs in the building, and you can rule that out because of the seismic signatures, and we didn't hear loud bangs, and we didn't see large explosions with flames and sparks and things coming out. We didn't see any of that. We saw the buildings turning to dust. And so this is where there appears to be a link between energy and Stephen E. Jones and what happened to the World Trade Center. So the next thing we come on to was the discovery of iron-rich microspheres in the residue from the destruction of the World Trade Center. And again, this is something that Stephen E. Jones talked about in a paper that he wrote, I think, in 2007 or 2008 with a few other people that they put together. And they said that they'd taken some World Trade Center dust and they'd found iron-rich microspheres in there. They claimed that this was an effect of thermite, and the problem with that is that you can't really say for sure. They claimed that it was thermite, but if you look at what thermite is, as I said already, it's aluminium powder and iron oxide. Well, the problem with that explanation as regards the destruction of the World Trade Center is that the exterior of the World Trade Center was an aluminium alloy, and the girders, which stood there for 30-odd years, they were rusting. And what's rust? Well, rust is iron oxide. So you had the components of thermite in quite large quantities already there in the World Trade Center without anybody planting anything. Now, of course, they claim that there were no tags, or there were tags, or you could determine that this wasn't the material that the World Trade Center was made up of, found in the dust. I don't know how they determined that, but that doesn't really matter because, as I've already said, if it was thermite, there would have been a huge thermal output, which wasn't seen. The dust, for example, wasn't hot. The dust drifted down the street, went over people. People were smothered and covered in dust. They weren't burned. People were quite near the buildings during the destruction. They weren't burned. And some of them reported that the dust was quite cool. And it was very, very fine dust, far finer than you would arguably get from something like thermite, which doesn't even create dust. It creates like molten metal, which was also claimed was found in the rubble. So the thermite is definitely a cover story. If you look at the evidence for long enough, you will see that it has to be a cover story because it doesn't explain what happened to the World Trade Center in any shape or form. Similarly, the bombs in the building story doesn't stand up to scrutiny, and that also rules out as well the idea of a nuclear device being planted in the basement. There was a Russian called Dmitry Karlazov who claimed that this was a nuclear device planted in the basements, and he did about 10 hours or 15 hours of video on this or something. But it's all ridiculous. You can see that a nuclear device didn't go off. There was no radiation. There were no loud bangs. There were no flashes. There was nothing commensurate with a nuclear explosion. The bathtub, which is underneath the World Trade Center, like this giant concrete tub, that remained intact. There was no flooding. The bathtub didn't flood. So those buildings didn't hit the ground in solid form. Therefore, it wasn't an explosion of any kind that destroyed those towers.
The important thing to note about Richard Gage and architects and engineers for 9/11 is that they only focus on Building 7, not the two tallest buildings in the world disappearing, turning to dust. And that's because the footage of Building 7, you could say, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. But if you have your headphones on and you're listening to the audio, that building doesn't make a sound when it collapses. And the seismic impact was no more than a jackhammer. You couldn't even really distinguish it from background noise. So that's not a 47-story building falling to the ground, I'm sorry. Now, that's a smart tactic to, focus on Building 7. Forget about the Twin Towers. They're not important. They only just turn to dust before our eyes, but let's not talk about them. Building 7 is the important one. And we're going to say it's controlled demolition, which the seismic data does not support that. The video evidence, the audio evidence. So come on, it's ridiculous.
A number of groups of people still to this day try to promote either the nuclear explanation for the destruction of the World Trade Center or the thermite explanation or variants thereof, one of whom is Chris Berlin, who has been on speaking tours talking about this, and he has a page on his website about how the author of the book Where Did the Towers Go is putting out disinformation. This guy is not a physicist, he is not a specialist in materials like Dr. Judy Wood is, so I don't really know why he would want to promote this explanation of thermite, which, as I've already shown, doesn't explain the evidence. However you try and kind of make it fit, it is the proverbial square peg in a round hole.
I really love that quote. It's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Because if you look at all these guys with all these different theories, there's one thing that they have in common: their hatred for Judy Wood. which is strange because she doesn't say anything bad about them. She doesn't try to claim who did it. She's just showing the evidence and explaining what it means. But you have Dimitri, you know, the mini nuke guy. He's made videos saying Judy Wood is a dangerous liar, and we just showed you Chris Bolin's. In my opinion, this smear campaign seems very calculated. They don't want you to know the true cause of the destruction of those towers, which was directed energy.